here with Richard Towle, the UNHCR representative in Malaysia. And I guess one of the first questions is, can you outline to us what the UNHCR does in Malaysia, in a country like Malaysia that is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees or its protocol?
Well, unlike many other parts of the world where governments normally take responsibility for protecting refugees, here it's the opposite. There are no laws in place to protect refugees. Anybody who needs refugee protection who comes here is seen as an illegal migrant. So UNHCR is the default. We step in and provide whatever kind of protection we're able to do in an environment which is not conducive to recognising the legal status of refugees here.
So as you say, refugees aren't recognised. So what can the UNHCR do to help create some kind of protection space as a first protection space for many of these people arriving from further afield?
Well, the first thing we have to do is to try and find them and identify who they are. And we have a tacit agreement with the government that if we register people and give them identity cards, then that will provide some immunity from expulsion and from arbitrary arrests, which the rest of the illegal migration population is prone to. And many employers recognise these cards as having some value, and a lot of people use the cards as a form of identification, which gets them access to the healthcare system in some ways and also to the employment market. So the registration with UNHCR doesn't provide a full range of protections in the way that we would like, or in the way that you might find in other places, but it does certainly raise them out of the pool of people who are determined to be illegal migrants in the country and who live a very, very tough hand-to-mouth existence.
I guess you've just raised a really important point. When we talk about refugees, often people think about the refugee camp, which is a confined space where services can be provided in that confined space. But one of the challenges here is you have to find them and they have to find you. And then find services, and you have to provide some services to a population that's scattered around Kuala Lumpur and around the whole country. What kind of challenges does UNHCR face in that regard?
Well, it provides challenges and opportunities. The challenges are, how do you find 150,000 people living in largely an urban environment? But the opportunities are for self-reliance and self-help are enormous. Refugee camps tend to be places of huge dependency where aid is dispensed and imposed with no huge degree of autonomy and self-independence of people. So unlike that, in an urban environment, people are on the downside left to fend for themselves, but when people do fend for themselves, they tend to be amazingly creative and ingenious in survival and basic livelihood techniques. So our job in an environment such as this is to empower and capacitate people, to help them survive, to help their community structures work more effectively, to get kids into basic education and people into some forms of work or self-reliance. So it's a very different working environment from the classic refugee camp, but I would suggest that globally most of UNHCR's work in supporting refugees is in an urban environment. A city environment is the way of the future, not the classic large refugee camps of the past.
Absolutely. You've just mentioned a number, 150,000. I was going to ask, how many refugees are there in Malaysia, which in itself is a bit of a contentious issue or question, because how do we define refugees, registered, unregistered, asylum seekers, in terms of numbers? Do you have a rough number for the ones that are registered by the UNHCR?
Well, we do. We have about 150,000 people who are registered with UNHCR as persons of concern. Those are people that we fully determined to be refugees, or people who we haven't had an opportunity to look at their cases in some detail, and who we may not, because we broadly understand that the driving factors for displacement are refugee-like. So there are, as I say, about 150,000 people, largely in an urban environment and mostly in the Klang Valley around Kuala Lumpur, who are refugees in need of support. But we know that there are a lot of people out there who we haven't yet been able to see. Probably 20 to 30,000 more people, and the number grows by the day because our major refugee producing country in the region is Myanmar, and within that we have some very serious displacement issues occurring in one part of that country, which is leading to instability and displacements into Bangladesh and across to Thailand and then down through to Malaysia. So we are seeing a lot of Rohingya refugees coming to this country, and we know of some, and there are many that we have yet to come across.
You've preempted yet another question in terms of what's the ethnic makeup, or what's the makeup of that refugee population? You said the majority are from Myanmar. What are some of the other refugee populations in Malaysia?
Well, of the 150,000 in ballpark figures, asylum seekers, refugees known to us, 135,000 come from Myanmar itself, and about 50,000 for Chin ethnic minority groups, about 35,000 from Rohingya. And then there are smaller numbers of other ethnic groups from Myanmar, Karen, Kachin and others. So together that makes up about 135,000. And then we have an increasingly and complex group of people coming from out of the region, people coming from as far afield as sub-Saharan Africa, from Sudan, Somalia, and many of the war and blight affected parts of the world are producing refugees who come as far as Malaysia. Given globalization and the ease of transportation these days, we are seeing larger numbers of people coming from those regions, and of course increasingly from Syria, Iraq, Iran, making their way across the subcontinent towards this region and coming to Malaysia, which in relative terms has a number of quite attractive features. It's a stable country with a solid economy and has a certain allure, if you like, of people who are in desperate situations.
Again, great segue to my next question in a way. What future is there for refugees? You mentioned there's about 150,000 people of concern. That's quite a large number of people, and there's 3 durable solutions in the UNHCR, one of which is resettlement, but that's only available for a limited amount of people. One is integration, and the last one is repatriation. Of those 3 durable solutions, what future do you see for those different refugee populations here?
Well, ideally refugees would be able to go home. That's what refugees want to do and dream about doing, is going back to their homes and cultures. And we hope that in the fullness of time the situation in Myanmar will improve to the point where various ethnic groups will have confidence in going back and voting with their feet to go back and restart lives in their own country. Resettlement is only a relatively small option for people. We have a program here, a very generously funded and supported program, particularly by the United States and by Australia, but that together only accounts for about 15,000 people a year. So those are, in relative terms, quite small programs, which leaves us with situations for people here. And I would add, in fact, not the third solution of local integration, but a solution that's built on the economic realities of countries in the region, and that's a migrant or labour migrant solution. If refugees are able to have their status regularised, and if they're able to work and employ themselves and be self-sufficient and contribute to the society such as Malaysia, then a labour migrant outcome offers as much, if not more, stability and security for them as a refugee outcome. And refugee status, of course, is only a temporary one, and a labour migration outcome could be more sustainable and more valuable both to the receiving country and to the refugees themselves. So we in UNHCR language these days talk about at least 4 solutions, and labour migration is increasingly an important one for us to try to integrate into our other strategies.
Is that being integrated in Malaysia at present?
It's not easily at the moment because refugees are not allowed to regularise their status. Unlike others, you can't go from refugee protection to a labour or a work visa status in this country. We think it's a step that's certainly worth pursuing. We have in the past had some very interesting discussions with the government here about that, but as of today it hasn't translated into any concrete policies that will allow that to happen. But we certainly think, given the active and vigorous and buoyant labour migrant and labour scheme here, particularly at the construction sites and the service and the utilities industry, where many people work anyway, to regularise the status of people in that market would be a good thing for the host community, host society, and a good thing for refugees.
Is there a precedence anywhere where UNHCR has made that sort of model work?
I think there have been status changes in other parts of the world. I know in India they're looking at a long-term visa status for refugees, and In Uganda, I think there have been some changes, and in Tanzania there was a regularization of the status of refugees there several years ago, which translated, I think, more than 180,000 people were given either full naturalization or a long-term resident right to remain in Tanzania. And of course that solves to a large extent the refugee dilemma, but also resolves a large number of other issues as well. So we think that's the kind of policy that's certainly worth considering here. Not a one-cap-fits-all refugee approach, but one that's multidimensional, takes into account the geopolitics and economics and economies of the region.
You've mentioned self-sufficiency, and it's also a fact that self-sufficiency doesn't always work. Can you tell us a bit more about the services that the UNHCR provides to particularly vulnerable populations in Malaysia?
What we're able to provide is limited. Frankly speaking, we have a relatively small budget for 150,000 people. We're not able to provide people with the level and measure of protection and support that we would like. But the critical feature here is empowerment, to try to identify the more of the vulnerable groups, more exposed in the community than others. After long periods of time here, some communities are quite well established. The Chin community, for example, have been here a long time, and their community structures and resilience and resourcefulness are very well established, whereas other more fragile and what I would perhaps suggest are fractured refugee communities are finding it much more difficult. Those who don't have any size of population here find it much more difficult, particularly the ones from out of the region. So Sudanese, people from the Middle East find it very, very challenging here. If they can't work, and to access the labour market is very, very difficult. So those are the sorts of challenges. We have a small program for funding to encourage livelihoods and self-sufficiency. We're very keen on education to try and get children into the schools. And again, in Malaysia, children are not allowed into the public school system. So we've established at a self-help level a remarkable network of education facilities in a parallel education system. And kids are now doing very well. I was at a meeting today where 2 children won scholarships and others were going on to an academic university and education at university. So there are some interesting examples of successes.
Here in Malaysia?
Here in Malaysia.
Oh,
so there are some outstanding students who, despite everything that they've been through, are able to survive and to be exemplary. But it's tough, there's no question. The tough elements are lack of legal status and simply the uncertainty of what happens not only now but to one's children in the future. There is no future set out in front of the eyes of many children and families in this country. And that's the tragedy, because these are lost lives and lost futures. They can't go home, there's no security here, and many will never be on a plane to a resettlement country. So these are the kinds of things that we have to address, is trying to allow people to be more buoyant and to be more self-sufficient and survive here in what is a pretty tough protection environment for many, many people.
One question that's important is about the status of the UNHCR, because you've mentioned you have negotiations with the government, but because Malaysia is not a signatory, is a peculiar situation for UNHCR as well as for the refugees who are here. Could you tell us a little bit more about UNHCR's position in a country like Malaysia?
It's not unusual for UNHCR to operate in a legal protection vacuum. I mean, many countries that have signed the Refugee Convention haven't put in place anything significant to do protection. So in situations like that, even though they've signed the convention, UNHCR really does a lot of the heavy lifting. It's not our preferred position at all. In a country like Malaysia, and there are many, many countries that haven't signed the convention that have long histories of dealing with refugees. In this region, if you look, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia haven't signed the convention, and yet they've hosted millions and millions of refugees, particularly during the Indo-Chinese crises or succession of crises from the 1970s onwards. So there's a long history of understanding about refugee movements through this region, and a long history of association between UNHCR and governments. We, in this building where we're talking today, We've been here since the mid-1980s, and our presence in this country goes back to the mid-1970s, which was around the time, as you know, of the collapse of the regimes of Southeast Asia and the flight or flood, if you like, of many, many refugees. So our time in this region goes right back to those days. Fortunately, they've now finished, long since go. But our role and function has now changed, as it does globally, to try and meet the contemporary demands of forced displacement globally.
Do you think it's still necessary, as some people advocate for, that countries like Malaysia should accede to the convention, and that should be sort of a first step, if you like? Or are there lessons learned in being a protection space without having signed the convention?
I don't think that signing the convention is necessarily a first step. I think it can often be the icing on the cake. I think what's more important is that states start to put in place a set of domestic arrangements through law and practice that provides protection to people. Now, whether they sign the International Refugee Convention as part of that is, it's desirable, it's preferable, because it sends a symbol to other countries as well. But if you look through the region, there are many countries that have signed the Refugee Convention that are not, quite frankly, living up to their obligations under the Refugee Convention, either through lack of will or lack of resources to be able to do it. So sometimes the dividing line between convention states and non-convention states is not so obvious. And we would often find higher degrees of goodwill and acceptance for refugees in countries which can barely deal with their own people. The true burden of dealing with refugees globally lies not on the shoulders of the industrialized world, but on the shoulders of the developing world countries. Most of the world's refugees are in the countries of the bottom of the developing world in OECD terms. And they don't complain. They look after refugees as best they can, and sometimes they host intergenerationally hundreds of thousands of refugees. So I think one needs to be very careful before you cast too many value judgments of countries that have signed or not signed the convention. And Malaysia is a good example. We've been here since 1975. We haven't been asked to leave in that period, and I think that probably suggests that we fulfill a function that is necessary and is seen as being valuable. Even if it's not overtly recognised and welcomed, it's still seen as something that's helpful in resolving an otherwise very difficult and sometimes geopolitical problem.
I guess one last question that relates to what I often hear from refugees when they talk to me when I ask them about the UNHCR. How do you deal, as an organization, how do you deal with the expectations of the people you work for and work with? Because expectations are very high in terms of becoming a refugee, a bona fide registered refugee, and then the expectation in a lot of the community is resettlement. And as you've mentioned, numbers for resettlement are very low. How do you manage that sort of expectation?
We don't meet the expectations of many of the refugees that we are responsible for and that we're charged to help. We don't meet those expectations for many reasons. We a very limited presence here in relation to the overall size of the refugee population. We have a budget here in Malaysia of $8 million to deal with a population of 150,000 people plus. And with that budget, we try to not only provide frontline protection, but we also provide support through health and education and livelihoods and a whole host of other forms of programmatic support. And to do that on a budget which, if I'm not wrong, is the same as the Department of Border Security and Border Protection Australia's media communications budget, if I read yesterday, I think puts in some comparison. We do a whole host of protection issues on the same budget as at the disposal of a wealthy, privileged state with the kind of resources that Australia has. I mean, it's a regional comparator. But so in all of that, it's very difficult to meet the expectations of people who are living out in communities in very, very tough physical and emotional conditions, where we're not able to offer them a future. We can offer them support in a present, but we're not able to offer them a future. And that's not within UNHCR's grant to offer, because those solutions lie beyond our strength. They are geopolitical solutions in Myanmar, larger resettlement, and a more accommodating, longer-term solution for people here. And those are not available for the time being. I hope if things change, if the settings change in the region, we might well be able to find some solutions for a lot of people. But for the time being, it's very tough.